enough of us here, 5, 10, 15, 20 people is a good shout. So we will get on with it. So just to remind everybody, I'm John Beckford, current president of the Cybernetics Society. This is the 25th, remarkably, President Series event that we've run, starting in the middle of the first lockdown, I think, and running most months since. They are not intended to be very, very, very heavyweight intellectual challenges and deeply into the theory of cybernetics, although sometimes occasionally they wander off in that direction, because we have absolutely no control over where the conversation goes. The idea is to invite two people who, purely personally, I think have something interesting to say, which is broadly of relevance to things that we're interested in, give them a platform from which to say it, and then we will all argue with them about it afterwards. By way of a reminder, this whole session is being recorded, and I'll chop off all the trivial bits and put the important bits on YouTube as soon as they're available, so you can revisit them and think, if only I'd thought of that question at the time, I might have got an answer. Couple of reminders, there's one of these every month, usually the second Wednesday. Next month we have Angela Espinosa talking about her recent work on the VSM and her new book. Angela worked with Stafford, as did a number of us over the years, so it's nice to see that one happening. And I'm hoping we have a second speaker, perhaps from the railway, but I'm still working on that one at the moment. So we'll reveal more later. So in the meanwhile, the process is Professor Oakland will be invited to take the floor for half an hour, and I run the stopwatch in the background to make sure he doesn't dribble on too long. And then we'll ask some questions for clarity. Then we will switch to Carl, who's sitting in the middle of my screen currently. Change subjects entirely, probably, and then we will ask Carl some questions, and then we'll spend the second better part of an hour sort of exploring the synthesis of the two sets of ideas we've heard, or indeed discovering that there isn't one, which is always an entire possibility. So no further ado from me. Questions and things into the chat as you see fit. John, if you want to share your screen, everybody else, can you go on to mute so we don't hear you coughing and spluttering in the background, please? And so Professor John Oakland, John and I have been chums for 20-something years since I wrote a book on quality and talked nicely about John's work. He is the British guru of quality, I think it's fair to say, and it would be unfair of me not to give him credit for the impact that the work of he and his colleagues has had in quality in this country over a quarter of a century. John continues to be, I think it's fair to say, at the leading edge of thinking in the area, and that's why he's here tonight to share that thinking with us. So, John, over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you all see my presentation there? Good. Well, thank you for joining this evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening and good afternoon if you're in Toronto. So in June 21, I was asked to give a talk on our research that we'd carried out on Quality 4.0, a la Industry 4.0. So as we move into the digital world of doing everything with robots and so on, what are the challenges around managing quality for those transitions? These were very successful projects, and we've had lots of publications. You can go on the CQI website and see 4 new case studies from the likes of BAE Systems just been released, one on Serco, the valve company, one on David Anderson of BAM Nuttall, the construction company. So that's been a great project on Quality 4.0. And what we did, what I talked about in June 21, we developed a concept definition and 8 principles, one of which was cybernetics, the whole thing about organizations needing to embrace the challenges presented by digitalization, and cybernetics was a very powerful set of principles that would help you do that. So that was so successful that the Chartered Institute followed this up with another project. They commissioned our group, which is the I'm Emeritus Professor of Leeds University Business School and head of the Oakland Institute, which is our business research and education division. And they wanted us to carry out a project on the future of assurance. And note, there's no quality word in there. It's not, if you like, just quality. It's how do we assure everything we're doing when we're transacting with our bank accounts through the webs and the apps and everything else. And so they wanted a project to embrace the digital world in terms of both how do you use technology to improve assurance, and what do you have to do to assure the new technologies. It was a very challenging project, and it took a year, or the most of 2022, and therefore in half an hour I can't really do justice to it. The topic of assurance may not be everybody's idea of excitement either, so I don't want to bore you to death. In fact, to make that point, John Gilbert, who was quality director of AXO, stood up at a conference and made everybody laugh by saying, you know, if you were to line up all the quality professionals in the world now, end to end, it probably would be a very good thing. So, well, I'm not precious about the whole field of quality assurance. What I want to do is to try to show you how deeply we've gone into this and the types of things that we've found. So just to point out that I've been joined by Professor of Supply Chain Management at Leeds University Business School, Chi Wong, Ian McCabe, who is a great leader in this field, very outstanding contributor in this field, and my colleague Katie Twyford. So I hope we can see that. It's a bit of a crowded slide, but it's basically saying that we've carried out a very systematic approach here with investigating, clarifying, validating, disseminating the work. 4 stages. First was knowledge. So what's in the literature? Carried out a massive literature, systematic literature search, looked at the work we'd done on Quality 4.0. And what we did from that, we developed a model for the future of assurance, based on a lot of the findings that we used in that came out of the Quality 4.0 research, which was what you need in any organization are 3 forms of integration. You need vertical integration, if you like, down the columns of the functions in a business or an organization. So if you're doing your marketing, what technologies, what digitalization are you doing, and how is it all integrated? So that's the vertical bit. Then there's the horizontal bit where you get all these functions joined up in an end-to-end type process. And then the full end-to-end integration is where you involve your suppliers and your logistics people who deliver the products or the services through. So we then took that model and we, if you like, assessed that. And our first way of doing that was to carry out an online survey of experts in the field, people we knew were at the frontiers of knowledge of this. And we asked them about, well, first of all, we asked them what they were doing in the field of digitalized assurance, if you like, and assurance of new technology. We asked we showed them the model, we asked them what we thought about it, and we asked them specifically to comment on each of the 10 components of the model. I'll show you the model in a bit. And also, are each of these components necessary? And are they together sufficient to describe the future of assurance, if you like? And it came back with a resounding tick. There basically was nothing missing, and they thought it was a really good model to take us into the future. We then went into the bottom right-hand box and validated all this by carrying out loads of interviews, focus groups of people who were active in this leading edge work, the likes of BAE Systems, Network Rail, and a few others, all in London talking to each other. They got a hell of a lot out of it. If you put together a group of very senior people from organizations like that, the synergy is fantastic. You know, they're learning from each other. They almost make friends, even if they didn't know each other beforehand. They'll go away and say, oh, I was really interested in what you were doing there, and so on. So we heavily involve people in organizations actually using digital assurance and applying assurance processes to digital operations. And that led us to develop the model, which we then went back to further publications and literature, National Society for National Centre for Cyber Security, for example, doing leading work in this, as you might not be surprised, identifying the knowledge, skills, and experience and behaviours that will be needed in the profession and in other professions. So, for example, you would not be surprised that the quality profession needs to embrace other professions like data analysts and so on, chief information officers and what have you, to really put in place frameworks, models, based hopefully on the one that we developed, to really move assurance forward into the digital age. So that was our research framework. What we finished up with there, the year's worth of work and doing all that, and those of you who've done research will appreciate, an enormous amount of output. I would say, I would go as far as to say it swamped the CQI in terms of how the hell what should we do with all this information and nuances of what you have to do and blah, blah, blah. So what I decided that a good idea would be to use the output from another piece of research we did many years ago, actually, on our framework for successful change. This is our figure of 8 change model. Very briefly, it's simple. It's like many other change models. You always have a need for change. Something triggers the need to change. You have to look at that, then you have to get within your organization or an institution like the Chartered Institute of Quality, for example, leadership and direction. You have to do some planning. And when you're doing this, you're going round the top ring of a figure of 8 model. And all that is about, that bit is about, is readiness for change, the strategy, getting your strategy right. Then you come out of that ring into things that link up the two rings of the figure of 8, moving into implementation. And that's bound to be through processes, the things we have to do particularly well to make this all happen. And then, having got the processes, you can set some organization resources around those processes, systems and controls to run things, and of course, behaviors. Behaviors are not, by putting it round the corner of the implementation side, it's not demeaning that how important behaviors are. It's just to say that if you don't understand stuff about the processes, you don't understand how you're going to set up the organization and resource it, and you don't understand what systems and controls you're going to need. It's too early to start talking about behaviors. But the beauty of the figure of 8, because you can see the arrows, it's like you would draw a figure of 8. You go round, and then when you come back through behaviors, you might say, well, actually, we're going to have to change some of those processes because we have these behavioral challenges to consider. And actually, we might have to go back into the top ring, which is the strategy bit, because that might not be sitting well. Now we've looked at how to implement this. So you can see the figure of 8 works very well. The head of quality improvement for the whole of the Airbus group, Bill Black, once said that is the best change model I've ever seen. And in fact, it's not surprisingly, because it was developed out of a very large research project involving many organizations who've done successful big change programs throughout the world. So going into that then, I'm going to share with you very quickly what we found and in the research on the future of assurance, and if you like, assign them to these parts of the figure of 8. So I'll visit each component of the figure of 8 with our findings and try not to bore you to death. So here we go. Here's the first one, readiness for change. The first thing up in the top left-hand corner, the real need to address is assuring the technology which the organization uses and using technology to assure the organization results. In other words, people have been saying things like, oh, well, yes, we can do, or we can set up a system and then audit it. And we used to have a clipboard, but now I'm using an iPad. No, that's not what we're talking about here. I did share with John after we'd had lunch just before Christmas, a video that's on YouTube, and it's about some robot dogs working in hydroelectric plants in a very godforsaken part of the world in Austria, up in the Alps, where you get high levels of water exchange and therefore energy can get created through that. A very horrible environment to work in. So they replaced all the quality assurance aspects, not humans, but using robotic dogs, which literally walk up and down this plant. If you type in on Google, robotic dogs in hydroelectric plants, it will come up and you can watch a 5-minute video, and it's absolutely unbelievable. It's also rather frightening. Never mind. So if we're going to change, there are going to be external pressures for change, and there's going to be internal ones. Some of the external ones to look at that first is customers and stakeholders generally don't think that the current way of people doing assurance, the way you operate your bank account, is going to work. You're not going to transfer money to the wrong place. That if we're making cars through robots, we're going to be making things well. We can't check them like we used to be able to do with human beings doing things. We're building the software into the robot to do the work. So how are we going to assure all that? So there's a lot of pressure from outside to get better at doing this assurance, and there's a lot of internal pressure to improve assurance efficacy and efficiency, vertical integration, in other words, quality, safety, horizontal integration, assurance performance. How efficient is it, and how good are we? How well are we using technology? So those were some of the identified needs for change. There's some interesting points, just to make 3 very important points from the research. The use of digital tools in assurance frameworks to better understand risks and their consequences is a major need. When you are introducing new technology, emerging technology, you need to understand the risks of doing that. And many organizations do not do that. They simply go ahead and, oh, that's good. We'll make the things using that robot. We'll offer care home through robotic involvement. The risks have to be properly understood, and they're often not. Secondly, the importance of digitalization and the applications of technology in assurance needs to be recognized right at the top of most businesses. And some or parts of business are still dragging behind on this, even though they're global operations that you would think would know better. Thirdly, in very large and complex product situations, assurance is provided in many ways, but it's currently too reliant on inspection. And unless you're going to have a robot doing that inspection, which you don't really want, you want the thing to be self-assuring by building in checks and corrections, machine learning, and so on into that assurance process. So many organizations, even very large ones making nuclear submarines, are still too reliant, for my liking anyway, in that area on inspection. And lastly, but not leastly, a very important part of this, of course, is many existing models of assurance have got to change, and they need to change to adapt to become more data-driven. And if we don't do that in this field of assurance, when the rest of the world is exploding in terms of data and so on, we're going to be in real trouble. So again, from the research, looking at we've got a little figure of 8 in the top right-hand corner, see where we are on the model. Now talking about clear leadership and direction. I'm not going to go into all of these areas, but again, from the research, in leading digitalization of assurance approaches and assurance of digitalized processes, the two sides of the coin, the impact on the organization's overall risk appetite must be understood throughout the organization. Those of you who've got investments in pensions, if you're being handled by a good organization, will have come to you and said, we'd like to look at your appetite for risk, because they want to match their investment portfolio on your behalf with your approach to risk. Simple idea. We don't do this in many organizations when it comes to assuring what we're doing for our customers, our stakeholders, our shareholders, and so on. Secondly, the policies and procedures for assurance involving obviously including those involving human resources, should consider the impact of the decisions that are affected by the use of technology such as AI and robotics. And what's tending to happen is we're not seeing what we call shift left happening enough. In other words, going back down the food chain, if you like, the end-to-end process, to the design areas, the design and development areas. When you're doing things more and more with artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, it's too late when you're already doing it to be checking how things are going. You've got to design in the assurance into the software, into the technology. And because people get very excited about new technology, want to rush into the marketplace and offer the product or service, we often find this, don't we? We've got an app on our phone and it just doesn't work. Or when you do this, it clicks you out and takes you somewhere it shouldn't do. And those are software problems. They're technology problems that people had not challenged right at the outset. And we've got to stop doing this, because if we carry on building in rubbish into our systems, the way we're all reliant more and more on technology and digitalization, there's going to be increasing amounts of catastrophe. I don't know if you have your own theory about that balloon that went from China over to America, but I actually don't think, it's not a political statement. I don't think it was a spy thing. I think it was just a cock-up. They probably did have a weather balloon, and there was something went seriously wrong, and it wasn't meant to be positioned over Minnesota or wherever it was. And finally, on this point, in cases where it's been recognized that business assurance in its current state is not fit for purpose for the future, there needs to be set up an executive director and board-led programs. You can't push this down to the junior quality assurance manager and expect them to deliver for the organization assurance that's going to be required in this future that we're moving into, with ever increasing use of emerging technology. So take this seriously, take it to the top, and just show how disastrous things could be if we don't get this right. So moving around sorry, we did a little bit of work on core principles for digital assurance technologies. So these came out as key things: transparency, proper engagement, being holistic and integrated, and having a common language. So there are some new things there for digital assurance that are not very different, but they are nuances to the principles of assurance that most quality professionals would trot out, if you like. So now I can move around to the planning. Obviously, any change, if you're going to embrace a change in the way we're doing assurance, either as a Chartered Quality Institute as a whole, or as ABB or HCB Bank or whatever, you've got to have stakeholder planning and you've got to do communications. So that's pretty obvious. When we move into the process side, what we needed in the research, having done all that work that I showed you in the 4-box model of the research process, was a new framework for assurance, a process model, if you like. And this is the major output from this research. If you remember nothing else about what I've said this evening, remember this. Now, obviously, you're not going to learn it by rote this evening, but it's a big deal. It's a major output from the research. It's a new model for the future of assurance. It has 10 components in it. Those components, as I said earlier, were validated with the online survey that we did. And together, each of them was seen to be necessary, and together they were sufficient. Now, what it starts with, on the left-hand side, you'll see the, obviously, we're talking about introducing new technologies, emerging technology into operations, banking, hospitals, manufacturing, including obviously artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, but a whole list of others as well. And what is important right at the outset is for the organization to consider the risks of deploying that technology, proper risk assessment. And I have to tell you, there's some improvements needed in that area for the way a lot of organizations behave when it comes to embracing new technology. It leaves a lot leaves a lot to be desired in terms of evaluating the risks. And when the other arrow, if you like, on that left-hand side, is identify the opportunities to leverage that technology. Not the other way around, not look for the opportunities to leverage the technology and then look at the risk. Do the risk assessment first. And then we can say, okay, we're happy with that, we can manage that risk, we can cope with things if they go wrong in the way we've done the risk assessment, and now we can embrace it. The middle of the chevron there is a series of things that you need to do when you're embracing technology, either in assurance or assuring the technology. Confirm accountability and governance. In other words, the risk appetite, the business strategy, the leadership, engagement and oversight, often not done in fields like this because they think it's some Egypt down in the bowels of the organization that will do that for us. It isn't. It's your job as the chief executive to take responsibility and know where the accountability lies throughout the organization. The middle piece is assess readiness for the assurance infrastructure, assure the use of technology, use technology to assure, those two sides of the coin, assure the procurement of the technology, because some organizations go flat out to get the technology in, they don't bother about the procurement, and then they find they've been supplied something that doesn't work. Alan Sugar, who is not my favorite businessman, I have to say, once was buying set-top boxes for Sky Television when they launched HD high-definition television, and they were on watchdog because they were supplying set-top boxes to homes that just didn't work. And the reason was somebody had subcontracted to supply to somewhere in the Far East, and they were paying £1 a box for a piece of technology like that. £1 a box. Not surprised that it didn't work. So,
John, 5 minutes, John.
Okay. The bottom way is confirm the data quality and security, and the data analytics, data governance, data engineering is another big deal. That's going to be very important. And when we've come to the end of the chevron, we've got to build trust. We're only going to build trust if we do all those things on the left-hand side. And we've got to then achieve integration, more and more integration, more and more people joined up in their thinking about this, how all of this works together. Now, I could stop there, but I have waved at you the figure of 8 thing. So I'm just going to romp through that to show you that I don't expect this to be extremely valuable to you this evening, but just to assure you that we have done a proper job on this. This is the piece where you go into organization resources. This has come out of the research. New assurance structures need to be developed to enable efficient and effective end-to-end process operation. Then we have the systems and control. We've looked at all that. We know what is needed, and some of the ones there are set in that diagram. When we look at systems and control, data quality is a big deal, massive deal. People are drowning in data, much of which is rubbish, needs validating, needs to be sure that we're covering it properly, and we've stuff to say about that out of research. Behaviors is our last box in the figure of 8, an aspect that often lacks focus and attention. All forms are needed, and particularly be aware of personal motivators. I've got an axe to grind here. I might lose my job, so I'm not going to let all this change happen. Person situations, the profession, the Chartered Quality Institute, for example, its context, the context of a quality professional in an organization. All of these things have been addressed in this research. And then we've made a call to action, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we have 6 calls for action. All of those are areas that organizations who are currently using or planning to adopt emerging technologies need to address using that model that I drew your attention to, the Chevron process model. And I won't go through it, but for example, the first one is generate demand for reliable and effective assurance across artificial intelligence and so on by collecting evidence on the risks associated with the technologies. And then we've got 6 of those all together. There's another 2, and there's another 2. So what we're saying to the, if you like, the profession, what we're saying to business, what we're saying to industry, is we've got this sorted out as to what you need to do. We've got a framework for you to use, and we've got some things here that you need to think about. And then finally, we've got some key messages. So be aware of the technology risk. The pace of technology change is absolutely phenomenal, isn't it? We all live in this incredibly digitalized world of emerging technology. And we've got to, let me just find that, yeah, here we go. So we've got to recognize that that's bringing unparalleled opportunities for organizations to disrupt themselves and enter these new markets. The promise of greater productivity and efficiencies and the elimination of human error is so tempting, it's well documented, but less well documented are all the new risks that are associated with that and the risk that it's creating for organizations. You can go bust doing the wrong thing in this area very quickly these days. Speed of adoption, complexity, ubiquity, it's everywhere. Technology is everywhere. So it means that these risks are rapidly increasing in both likelihood and impact, and they're often built into the technology, built into the software, not noticed. So get ready to assure. Current assurance approaches alone that we know and love are insufficient to address these risks. And assurance leaders in the profession and in companies who are the head of quality or head of information or whatever need to engage better with their stakeholders through this, and I'll repeat it, vertical, horizontal, end-to-end integration. A full understanding of the risks and how to mitigate them. And finally, and I think this is very appropriate for a cybernetics society presentation, resulting changes to assurance scopes and approaches require new skills and capabilities that assurance teams need to start developing today to remain relevant for the future. And as part of this, ethical assurance, inverted commas, will be key to help ensure that embracing new technology, when organization embraces a new technology to do their service or make their product, they're confident that the way in which they're doing so is consistent with their brand and their culture, so that it allows them to demonstrate integrity and build essential digital trust. Now, there's some more slides, but I think that message is the one I'd like to finish on. There you are, John.
Brilliant. Thank you, John.
Do I go on? What do I do? Stop sharing?
Stop sharing so we can all see all of our happy faces.
Yeah,
'Cause,
there we go.
the thought that's wandering around in my head as I listen to all of that, and a number of parts of it are obviously familiar, is yes, there's a risk associated with embracing the new technology, but is the bigger risk associated with not embracing it? And are our leaders, our organizational leaders, anywhere remotely near enough to understanding the potential of the technologies to actually do this sensibly? Right.
Well, first part is absolutely right. We can't we can't not embrace the technology. If you're not embracing the technology, when you're running a banking service, you won't have any customers because everybody will have gone on to iPhone apps that they allow them to pay the bills with in a blink of an eye. So you can't not, you're absolutely right. The risks of not doing it are to go out of business, or if you're in the public sector, to not deliver the service as well. And there are many public sector, or let's put it this way, organizations that are delivering services to the public who are just not doing as much as they could, including the health sector, with new technology. What I'm saying, John, is having said we've got to embrace the technology and implement it, do we do enough to understand the risks? Not so we'd say, let's not do this, but what are the risks and how do we assess them and how do we mitigate them? So the software is very fragile in this particular product. So how are we going to, what can we do to stop that happening? For one thing, stop launching products and services into the market when you know full well there are faults in them. We all see this, and we're all frustrated to hell by it. And they do it to make money quickly or whatever, but they damage their reputation, and some organizations fail completely. Second point.
Okay, so let me intrude.
The second point, I'll just take that. You're absolutely right. They're not necessarily equip the top men, women, and you see this all the time, what they say in the newspapers and the television, but they need to know where to go in their organization to get help. A lot of them don't even know that. Anyway,
that's scary, isn't it? Thank you. So we'll have two quick questions. One, I think Matthew, I think your hand went up first, and then Rory, and then we'll go on to Carl. And then we'll come back around and I've got 27 questions written down. So Matthew first, please.
Hello, thank you for the talk. So when I was just had a thought going through my mind throughout most of it, was kind of when you're thinking about quality and insurance, I was thinking risk versus.
You're thinking of what?
You don't really see quality. You don't really see maximum quality. So most of the time it's usually on a scale, and you'd compromise some quality to maybe have an extra benefit somewhere else. So you think of quality versus quantity and risk versus reward. So I was wondering if anywhere in your research you considered sort of compromising quality.
No, because if you read all my stuff on quality, you realize I come at it from this point of view. Quality is not an option. What does quality mean? It's meeting the requirements of our customers. So how do you compromise on that? You do so by going out of business or not meeting the requirements of your customers. If you're talking about Rolls-Royce quality versus Mini quality, it's a misunderstanding. That's a function of what the customer requires. So a Rolls-Royce to a person who wants to drive around London and find a place to park for it, it's not a quality vehicle. It's not meeting their requirements. So we've not got high quality and low quality, except that this doesn't work or it doesn't meet my needs properly. I thought it did. In my understanding of the way this was designed, I thought it would do this for me, and it turns out it doesn't. Or it would have done if it had been made properly, but it's not being made properly. So it promised to do me what I wanted, but now they've cocked up in the service or whatever. So we don't compromise on quality if we expect to stay in business or meet our requirements. What we need to understand is the costs of doing all that. If you fail regularly and you're having to give warranties, or if you're paying out, warranties, you'll be costing the organisation a fortune. If you're killing people.
I'm going to interrupt you, John, because time is moving on.
Yeah. Well, I hope I got the message over.
Carl, so Rory,
You did.
I'll start with a basic question, and then I'll start with a rebuttal for one of the points that John made. And it's less of a rebuttal and more of just noticing a change. The first is, how would you define assurance? I respect that that's a very stupid, possibly stupid question, but how would you define assurance? And the second thing, you're noting that technology is coming out into the commercial space and it's got failures in it. That's a fundamental part of how technology, at least recently, has developed. This idea of minimal viable product, bottoms up iteration instead of top down planning. So do you think that that's going to change, or is that still the way to go for technology? Because the thing is with technology is that especially with software as a service, you can update it constantly, rather than a car where once you built it, that's it. It's much more difficult to update. So that's more, I think, to summarize it, where does top-down planning and bottom-up iteration fall into what you said about the importance of quality and assurance and not putting out bad technologies? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think assurance is a pretty self-defining word. It's about how we make sure that what we said we would do, if you like, is being done. And thereby we are answering, addressing the second part of your question, because we all know that in the world of software and technology, particularly software, not so much the actual physical technology, we hope that would work. In other words, there can be problems with robotic arms. If you see cars being made with robots, you get an arm on a robot doing that forever, 7 days a week, 7/24, whatever it's called, 365 days, that arm. Now, if somebody has bought some clips that hold the wires in that arm together too tight because they were cheap, and it starts to erode the insulation on the thing, and then the arm stops working or throws a spanner across the room every so often, then you're going to have a technology problem as well. So you've got the software and you've got the technology. So we all know that software products are put out, new iPhones come out, and then they do an upgrade, and you see an app says, oh, we've got rid of all these bugs and so on. So what we're talking about in that sense is not to say never put anything out until it's perfect. Of course not. But to assess properly the risks of what we've got in there. So what are the risks? Well, these are, catastrophic risks. If this happened, that could kill somebody. Please don't put that product out yet, or that service. And therefore you talked about top planning, top down, bottom up. Absolutely right. The whole field of Hoshin Cannery planning is built out of the total quality management facility, if you like. It's all about understanding what the planning is and how we cascade that through the organization and get the bottom-up catch ball process. You know, yes, we can do that, or no, we can't do that, we need to change it a bit. That's all part of this TQM approach. And what we need, the technology, if you look at technologists and data analysts and people who are involved with digitalization, quality is not on their radar screen often. They've not been brought up with quality in their thinking. It's not, they don't understand it. They don't understand how you manage it, set up a system for it, and so on. And so they often, without attention to certain things, particularly in the risk area, but also in data quality, for example, blindly going ahead, pushing things out on us. And as consumers, we're finding the faults and we're suffering accordingly. And we're also, because of that, just because, to finish, because of that weakness, cyber attacks take place. And we're all vulnerable, you know.
I think what I'm taking from this is that I think we're on the same page. I think what I'm taking is that there needs to be a greater respect for the risks of putting out a product that is unsatisfactory. That if you're going to put out an app, it's perfectly fine to say, well, it's not going to be perfect, we need to improve it, but recognize that if you're putting out a technology that's meant to do something, then if it goes wrong, then there's going to be a consequence, and there needs to be a greater respect for that, rather than thinking we're just going to put something out and yes, it's not very good, but we're going to improve it, but as though that has no risk, that does have risk.
And you know,
gentlemen, I'm going to stop you because we are drifting on, and I want to hear from Carl, because I know Carl's material is going to offer some alternative suggestions in some of these areas. And so Carl and I don't know each other as well as John and I, but we've had a few conversations over recent weeks and months about challenges of asset management and circularity and all sorts of peculiar things that have sort of emerged from those sorts of conversations. So without further ado, if I could introduce Carl and give him half an hour or thereabouts, and Elena, when we come back at the end of that, yours will be the first question that I will take, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Thank you. So everybody else on mute, please.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. Can everyone see my screen, by the way? Because I can't see what you're seeing. I'm hoping. Yep. Yeah. Good. Okay. So it's probably a bit unfair for the rest of you, apart from John, because he's read a paper that I wrote and launched back in November from the Institute of Asset Management. So first and foremost, I'm a principal at Fraser Nash Consultancy, which is an engineering consultancy. We do a lot of stuff in advanced technology, and I've produced, or I'm in the process of producing, a second white paper. I produced the first paper, which was the Institute of Asset Management white paper on how asset management can be an enabler for the circular economy. That's online. You can go and have a look at that. And the second white paper, Rail as an Enabler for the Circular Economy, is going to be launched at the Circular Economy Network for Transportation Systems in Cranfield in May. So that's been funded by EPSRC. I'm also a lecturer at the University of Derby and have virtually no spare time as well. But there we go. Let's see. So just to put things into context, to provide some background, I'm a chartered engineer. I've been around the block a few times, I suppose. I'm also a chartered IT professional, and my professional career is mainly around strategic consulting within engineering management systems, complex engineering management systems. And I've been involved in understanding and applying systems theory, or in some shape or form. I've been doing that for about 30 years. I was introduced to it when I took my master's at university about 30 years ago. And since that time, I've deployed it in many situations in and around how organizations manage engineering infrastructure. My background is in rail predominantly. I've designed rail trains. I've also provided advice and been a reporter for the UK rail regulator, and some of my reports on the performance of Network Rail are online off the rail regulator site. I've also done similar things in Hong Kong as well. And I just decided to do a PhD on the deployment of systems theory and asset management because I thought it'd be a good thing, because I've got plenty of experience about that. And one of the challenges I had when I looked into the deployment or the effectiveness of asset management is that it was predominantly associated with asset management, predominantly associated with delivering corporate goals. And if your corporate goals are unethical, which you could argue that some organizations' corporate goals are unethical, then you can have an asset management system which is very effective and very efficient at doing very unethical and immoral things. So I couldn't deal with that. My PhD sort of took a bit of a different direction, and I then picked up on that's probably after about a year. Probably picked up on a circular economy, which appeared to provide some leverage in terms of aligning the value that the engineering or asset management or even companies do. And if they adopt circular economy principles, whatever they may be, and again, I'm just talking about what these were at the time of my research, then that might be a good thing. And we could apply systems theory and asset management activities and combine the circular economy to present some form of view or framework which would say this is how good things are in the wider context. Going down a number of rabbit holes in looking at in and around the circular economy, it's a fascinating subject. Some of it's circular economy greenwashing, I suppose, because it's just totally impractical. Some of the stuff works or it doesn't work rather, because it assumes the current way in which the current economy works isn't going to change, but ultimately the evidence shows that the economy needs to adapt and prioritize different things. And also it's part of sustainability in terms of the genuine definition of the word sustainability, not in terms of sustainability as far as compliance goes. And this is actually very important. We get sort of situations like the sustainability thought police where some of the characteristics and behaviors of people and organizations have to comply, which doesn't necessarily help sometimes. So we produced the Institute of Asset Management white paper. I'm the chair of the knowledge group for the Institute of Asset Management, and through my academic connections, we won some funding from the EPSRC to then transition the Institute of Asset Management white paper for a rail orientated white paper. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the slides for I'm going to flip between the Institute of Asset Management slides and the rail circular economy slides, and then I'm just going to talk about some applied work in terms of how we've actually applied it and where the evidence sits to generate value around these things. So the rail paper is an extension of the Institute of Asset Management white paper, and I've already talked about really why the circular economy is sort of important to the Institute of Asset Management. And if we look at how you manage asset infrastructure, obviously there appears to be some very strong alignment with making assets last longer, changing the value or adapting the value from whole life cost of assets towards whole life value. And therefore we might be looking at what value those assets enable in wider society, which is really interesting because I don't think that those values are captured appropriately. And then I was able to get Network Rail involved in the work as well, in the research, as well as people I know in the Office of Rail Regulator and the wider rail industry. So we had a at a sort of selection of the spectrum of the stakeholders in the rail sector, which was really good, and the work so far has gone down very well. So we looked at the sense work, looked at the enabling changes and incentives in our present rail, in terms of how the current railway works at the moment. And then we looked at different actors and stakeholders in terms of how that might work. I don't think you've seen this, John, but this is a slide from the Institute of Asset Management white paper, the idea is that there's so much fluff around the circular economy that we took it as an opportunity to just reiterate some of the correcting work that's been done by a number of individuals in this particular field, where people's perception of the circular economy is just about recycling. It's really not about recycling at all. Recycling is the lowest form of value within the circular economy context in terms of assets or anything. Recycling anything is just really bad. The best thing you can do is to actually make something last forever. Scientifically, it's impossible to make things last forever. So there are obviously opportunities where you may want to redesign things to make them last forever because they weren't designed in the first place to last forever. So you can see where this is coming from. The number of opportunities that you're presented with, if you think about these things, are quite tremendous. And also, the other sort of misnomer is the circular economy is about materials, and the answer is not wrong, but it's not the best answer in terms of understanding materials as the lowest common denominator in terms of its, because the material value of anything that's been recycled is literally the lowest value entity if you get out of the value chain. And I read something a while ago that the material value of an iPhone is $1, for argument's sake. So why would you want to go and melt it down or deconstruct it to go and get $1 out of it? Why didn't you go and design it to last longer in the first place? So a number of themes are kicking around. So you can argue, so well, it's actually all about consumption. You go, well, yes, actually consumption is a big issue here, because people get rich based on motivating and increasing consumption, because the organization's operating model is purely based on consumption, on profit, for argument's sake, which that in itself isn't sustainable. Because if you look at the mantra that the value of the circular economy is based on, in terms of saying, well, we need to shift away from a take, make, waste society, then that's also very interesting. That's certainly something which we need to do as well. The carbon mantra is also it's a pathway, right? So it's a means to an end, right? And it's been indoctrinated in our mindset and society that we need to be carbon neutral or net zero or what have you. But as a society, we shouldn't have really got there in the first place. So you can argue that carbon neutral is just about doing the most urgent things first to get to a situation that is preventing it from getting any worse than it is now. It doesn't necessarily say how we're actually going to start to recover and restore the types of things that we need to do to put the environment, for instance, back to where it needs to be. But so there are a whole host of things which need to be thought about. And the idea about also producing the white paper was to provide some clarity in an asset management context, because there's so much stuff out there which is very difficult to understand and very, very difficult to scale. I thought it'd be a good idea to put the deployment of the circular economy and the value of the circular economy into context. So the Institute genuinely believes that it's the next evolution in asset management. It's talking about capturing the externalities that the assets enable, and they've now changed their mantra very handily to outcomes matter. So it's the outcome of the asset in terms of what it does, what it enables, which is really important. And coincidentally, they've also changed their asset management guidance and model. So it's got a few more blocks in the model if you want to go and have a look at it, which essentially doesn't incorporate the dispose area of the model, which is handy in a way. The other thing is to introduce the concept that future competition will be based around asset performance. So if you design something that will last forever or have multiple life cycles, which is a concept which is relatively new, particularly in infrastructure fields, then this is obviously a good thing. And therefore it puts the performance of your assets in a new context. So again, that opens up opportunities where you can provide additional value. So value can be influenced by a whole raft of things, but some of the main things here is, what are you going to regenerate and restore when you do this? Are you going to create new jobs, new businesses that get involved in remanufacturing? Are you going to restore the United Kingdom's competency and capability in manufacturing again to come up with new and advanced designs for things that last forever? So you go, and nobody does that. So that's pretty innovative, isn't it? So these are the types of things that that the Institute of Asset Management is sort of trying to promote. The other thing about the circular economy is that you can't avoid reading or coming across the term systems thinking and the circular economy. They're interdependent, but my research has determined there's virtually no systems thinking whatsoever in and across the circular economy, which I just find really weird, because everybody talks about it, and I think everybody sort of knows what that means, but can't break out of the current operating model in terms of, well, if we do work and partner with other organizations, there aren't any metrics which would create incentives for us to do that, other than trying to make more money, for instance. So these wider contexts need to be understood and developed. So just as some context, you can't be circular economy compliant. There's no point in doing that, because it's not the same thing. But you can actually be more circular economy effective than your competitor. But obviously you'd have to define what that means in your own organizational context. So we explain where the thinking should start from in the white paper from the Institute of Asset Management, and I came up with three points, what I call points of entry, which is based around complex and adaptive systems. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But just looking at the conventional asset management life cycle, these are the types of things that asset managers would be familiar with up until the production of the white paper. And this is basically taking a take, make, use and waste activity. The maintenance and operations are planned on the life of the asset. There are interventions to make assets last longer, but we'll have the supply chain trying to flog you new assets that offer performance, but ultimately they'll have an end of life. And that burden is passed over to the organization that buys the products. There aren't very many alternatives. Whereas if you looked at what a circular economy asset life cycle might look like, you then go and expand it to a whole range of opportunities where you may be able to create value in and around some of these other areas. So you can design in for reuse. Is that asset going to be redeployed elsewhere? And this actually happens in the rail sector. They cascade assets into different parts of the infrastructure that are less critical. For instance, designing out excess waste, it's where it's just unnecessary. Designing in maintainability, so you can improve a whole different raft of things, and manufacturability, making stuff easier to deconstruct or reassemble or what have you. So these are the types of areas where we might want to go and have a look at, from a traditional asset management life cycle to a more complex one. And in terms of where to start from, you can start from these 3 points. So given that the assets that you've got were designed to work within a more circular economy kind of way, they will have a finite life cycle. Then perhaps the manufacturers that manufactured them in the first place would want to actually know more about the performance of their existing assets that they sold, because if they did that, then they'd be able to put that information to good use to go and redesign their products. So instead of having just one life cycle, they could have 5. And there are a whole raft of different types of opportunities around here. You can say, well, instead of just manufacturing stuff in China, you can actually have local remanufacturing businesses in and around the railway infrastructure, if that's what we're talking about. And then if you're looking at so this is obviously related to the before and after place where to start from. So designing assets that enable future circular economy activity and principles. So that has a much broader impact on the economy, which is very positive. And also overarching practices, which are more to do with strategic networks, I would say, of actors and stakeholders that would go and extend and create that additional value. So it just doesn't have to be about a railway, for instance. It could be about a manufacturing facilities that are also used for other manufacturing capabilities, to diversify the types of criticality of the types of things that are manufactured, which will then have a more positive impact on the economy. So there are lots of things which can be done in and around there, instead of just thinking about things in a linear context. So we had Network Rail involved, and they have their sustainability strategy. And in their sustainability strategy, it does mention things like the circular economy. Disappointingly, it's sort of focused around the lowest form of value around the circular economy, and as I've mentioned, it's associated with dealing with waste. And also, I felt this is a bit of a low starting bar, because what they're doing here is they're responding to forthcoming environmental legislation, and they're rebranding this as part of their circular economy value proposition, which is, in some respects, I'm hoping they're not going to count it twice. So the other thing is they're also looking at asset management processes around longevity, which is what the Institute of Asset Management white paper is promoting. They're looking at low carbon, which is obvious, the positive outcome of making things lasting longer. Thinking about the types of things that they can do with supply chain and interdependencies across life cycles. But as a general rule, we promote the concept, or try to define what circular economy value is, that anything that grows the economy. Now, this is perceiving the economy not necessarily in its present form, but an adapted form, which appreciates value in different kinds of ways. Anything which reduces consumption, and anything which has increasing regenerative and or restorative outcomes. So those are broad contexts to which you'd have to define what those are. And it doesn't necessarily mean tree hugging. It just means doing something that's more positive than you were doing before in any form of context. And the other thing is, from a systems point of view, is doing it all at the same time. It shouldn't necessarily work in a linear fashion. So anything which has those 4 characteristics would have some form of circular economy value. Now, there are problems with how organizations want to interpret that themselves. And this is where assurance comes in, and the integrity of how organizations want to interpret that, because there are lots of different things that there's a whole raft of different circular economy principles that organizations can adopt, and they can be purposefully selective of some of those principles, but still then brand their behavior as taking circular economy activity, which can result in things like concepts such as circular economy rebound, which is where you get ridiculous situations where an organization has gone and changed their materials to be more environmentally friendly, but in doing so they've rebranded their products to be more environmentally friendly, but that by its nature increases consumption, which is not the intended consequences. So just switching to the rail white paper, the type of things, well, the things that we did, we actually ran 3 workshops. The 2 workshops were for the rail sector in general, which included the Office of the Rail Regulator and the supply chain. And luckily we had some funding left over, and we went and did the same workshop again, but had a rail freight focus. So I've slipped in some of the slides in here for the rail freight focus as well, which is really interesting. Now, these blobs are actors and stakeholders that make up the railway. It's not supposed to be comprehensive, and the feedback loops that we have here are not supposed to be comprehensive either. They're just a representation of some form of main relationships and interaction between these actors and stakeholders. Now, the workshop that we ran at seeing what the challenges were, which is moving products from single points of sale to where products would then have multiple life cycles, and moving towards a situation where organizations would lease products as a service, for argument's sake. And what the evidence shows here is the reduced life cycle cost that can be achieved from designing products that have 4 life cycles instead of 1 life cycle. And what we can see is the change in behavior here, where the burden of all of these things, which are taken on by an organization that buys a product and takes on the responsibility of it and maintaining it and what have you, as opposed to an organization that sells products as a service. So that could be like, say, Rolls-Royce, like Power by the Hour. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a new phenomenon. There are a number of organizations which do this and do rather well out of it as well. But for some reason, it hasn't been implemented successfully across across a number of sectors. But obviously, what we were talking about is what are the main challenges, blockers and enablers that sit in the industry, which would stop the rail sector, for example, taking advantage of this reduced life cycle cost. Where would the value sit across these stakeholders and actors that would want to take a benefit from this? So what we tried to do is we tried to look at a future vision in terms of what the future upcoming circular economy work streams that Network Rail would want to take on if they adopted these types of things. And they would be moving towards whole life, shifting from whole life cost towards whole life value. They would be looking at products as a service. So from a whole railway infrastructure point of view, it's a reasonable question to ask: what could be operated as a product as a service? What assets could be operated as a product as a service model? And I don't think anyone's got an answer to that, but that's a very interesting question, because if you're a motor manufacturer for a set of points, is it possible for you to go and charge the number of switches per price per switch? And is it viable for you to go and wire up that motor to understand the performance of that motor so that you could essentially create a business out of that service? Now, obviously, there are a lot of technical blockers that exist in the rail sector to stop you from doing that. But, what are they, and can they actually be removed? It obviously involved working with the supply chain and different types of innovations. They are starting to have a low carbon materials register. Not entirely sure how that gets deployed, other than maybe I don't know, setting a balance between things that have high and low carbon registrations, and updating the procurement processes, which I'll come into in a minute. So in terms of the rail freight thing, we did a bit of soft systems. Thank you. We did a soft systems thing where we looked at trying to understand the value of freight. We very quickly determined the reason why freight even exists on the rail sector is because it's far too expensive, putting the amount of lorries that it would cost. Well, it's just virtually impossible. You'd have thousands more lorries, but it just ruin the road infrastructure. The reason why freight is run as bulk is probably because it's just far too difficult to do that as on road. So they're basically getting, in terms of being able to exploit the opportunities from rail freight, everything is driven by price, which is it's not a level playing field. It's absolutely not a level playing field. So again, we basically set up these actors and stakeholders for the rail freight sector. We looked at the challenges associated with, and we get back to the products as a service model approach, which is just one circular economy activity of which you could do lots. And basically, we came up with a number of, aids which help the stakeholders look at different perspectives. So, which is wanting to understand what these spectrums were. When you try to think of things like products as a service or things which create circular economy value or the impact of them, what is the impact going to be in an economic context? And that looks at financial flows and its fluidity. It's not value extraction, which would have a detrimental impact on any circular economy value whatsoever. But it's predominantly associated with financial flows. Carbon's in there because it's going to be more or less reducing or increasing the number of asset life cycles will obviously reduce the carbon impact. Shifting from whole life cost to whole life value, and then looking at the sustainability and resilience of the business to literally survive. It's the viability of the business to survive in the broader social and environmental spectrum. So here it's looking at not only the viability of the business, but the viability of the regenerative outcomes that it goes and creates. As part of that outcome. These were a number of aids as well. So this is where the value is going to sit in some context: reduce raw materials and energy costs, scarce resources that can be minimised, social wins, new employment opportunities for new types of skills. Well, they're not actually new types of skills; they're skills which are done somewhere else. But it's probably better to improve the resilience to actually have them done locally. And if you can imagine, you can have clusters of these types of things. I'm doing some work at the moment on the Tees Valley cluster within a strategic context. So these are the types of things. Economic wins, the value leaks and losses are reduced waste management costs, because you're not actually going to create them. You're actually doing something which just avoids waste, not necessarily entirely, but it's certain different types of waste. So there are lots of things that you can do. The general findings suppose. Can you still see my screen? Yeah. You've stopped. Can you still see my screen?
I can see the screen.
So,
yes,
here we've got developed a number of maps. It's going to be blurry. Yeah. Can you see my screen still? Okay. So here we developed, from the outcome of the workshops, we developed a number of maps which looked at the blockers and enablers, which would help us create a railway that worked towards a circular economy environment, and we came up with a number of different things. So the Department for Transport needs to set up a level playing field in context for circular economy value. Network Rail, for example, would be looking at procurement incentives for circular economy type of behavior in the supply chain, a whole raft of different things. The supply chain would be looking at extending life of existing products, and obviously they'd be incentivized to do that in some shape or form. Looking at products as a service versus service-based ownership. So there's a whole raft of different things that we could do. The railway regulator, balancing short and long-term needs. These are the types. So there'll be a whole raft of new regulatory activity that the rail regulator would need to do. Then, as part of the rail white paper, we were just looking at. You'd probably be familiar with some of these things because it's set up more as a viable system for the whole of the railway, but it's looking at a very high level. It's looking at overarching rail effectiveness. So this is having positive impacts on the environment by offsetting road freight onto rail. We couldn't actually find where that responsibility sat in the broader governance, but that's of no consequence for this research. And then looking at the positive impact on health, positive impact on businesses. All of these things would need to be known about and quantified, so that we can provide a balance across the deployments between the different modes. And then looking at the relationships between the relatively new subnational transport bodies. So Transport for the North, for instance, they've got legislative authority to set their own agendas, I believe, in terms of how that works. So, and from that, we've elicited a number of blockers and constraints. So some of the things that Network Rail aren't very good at are things like just having an open door policy for creating new business opportunities for anyone that wants to use the railway more, for instance. It's extraordinarily difficult to do that type of thing.
Can I get you to come to a conclusion, Carl, please?
There we go. That's very time. So, what we felt is the identity of the organisation needs to shift towards what regenerative and restorative outcomes it wants to be known by, and this needs to be embedded within corporate strategy. This is very much in line with how asset management works, in terms of developing asset management strategies and plans and implementing those types of changes. Circular economy compliance is meaningless, but you can show how you apply circular economy principles in your own context, and show how more effective that is compared to your competitors. And you could instantly or very rapidly create a strategic relationship with a number of other companies, which would then create or exponentially create that additional circular economy value. In terms of understanding how to do that, we're consultants. So we've also developed a service portfolio to advise clients on how they can create circular economy value, for want of a better expression. So we can provide things like a strategic assessment, which is around the concept of viability and how it should be carried out to determine what needs to change in the organisation. So this would involve co-worker sessions, would explain what the circular economy is, what it might mean into their business, and then look for opportunities for developments to adapt policy and strategy, which again is very much in line with the approach that the Institute of Asset Management has adopted in making those business improvements and those changes. And that's it, really. There you go, John.
Superb. Thank you very much. So if you can unshare, then Carl, take your pictures away.
Yeah.
And I have many questions that I've written down, but Elena, I promised I would come to you first, and here I am. So
okay, well, thank you. I think my question has more to do with the first presentation, but perhaps is applicable to the second as well. I wondered about the overlap between the auditing of soft information and the quality assurance work, particularly with regard to undocumented liabilities. One of the big problems for an auditor of a complex organization is to basically satisfy him or herself that the completeness assumption has been satisfied, and quite often it hasn't.
So, Carl, if I come to you first, that's a great question, Eleanor. I love it. Carl, if I come to you first, then I'll go back to John.
I hope I've understood your question, and I'll give you an answer. Then you tell me if I've understood your question right. So that's really interesting. That's a very good question. So what we have in the railway, and I've got to try and explain this right. What we have in the railway is a range of is a plethora of standards, performance standards, to which you buy things by, and from an assurance point of view, you can validate the characteristics of the products and the services that you procure, and those are done through the validation of those is done through standards. Now, in many ways, in many respects, that has constrained innovation significantly, so that things work very slowly. What we've observed, if we're wanting to develop things within the circular economy context, and for instance, we could use product as a service as an example, is that the client is more interested in the performance of the asset, not necessarily what it is. And it's the performance of the asset that essentially represents the competition. If we are able to identify standard interfaces where the interfaces won't change as frequently as the products change, or rather, let me see if I can get this right, where interfaces don't necessarily change at a high level of frequency, then manufacturers or organizations which want to generate revenues from products as a service can work towards those interfaces. And therefore, the performance, the liability of the performance, if it's done within a products as a service approach, is the liability of the supplier or the manufacturer. And those liabilities will be set up through contractual frameworks which say, well, no, you're not. And interestingly, it comes back to what the previous to what John was talking about previously, is to say, well, if it doesn't work, if the product fails or provides less performance than expected, then the competition, competition will come in and just go and replace it, very quickly and very effectively. So, and I'll give you an example around, say, washing machines, for instance. So, a washing machine costs about £400. I use the washing machine to wash clothes. I don't particularly want to own a washing machine because I know that the manufacturer's gone and designed it to last not too much longer beyond the warranty period. And then it becomes, it's my problem that as soon as it expires the warranty period. But if someone could come to me and say, I can rent a washing machine for, I don't know, £1 a week or something, or £2 a week forever, right? Then, and if it goes wrong, we'll come out and fix it. In fact, we've wired up the washing machine so well that we'll come out and send someone out to go and repair it before it breaks, and that's even better, right? So that's not an unreasonable thing to do. And then in future, if I'm only being charged £2 a week, and someone comes up to me and says, I'll offer you the same for £1.70, then I'll go, okay, that's an easy decision for me. However,
I'm going to intrude, Carl, because John's waiting to answer. I would just point out that the students in the room might be objecting to the cost of renting washing machines in student accommodation at £2 a week when they know they could buy one for 300 quid and save money over 5 years. John, any thoughts?
I didn't know you were a washing machine salesman, John. Anyway, well done. I'm reminded of many years ago when I went to Exxon's head office in Belgium, in Europe, in Belgium. And I knew this guy from his career in the quality management fraternity, and he'd become head of audit. And I was talking to him about his job, and he said, when I turn up with my team to audit big deals and things in Exxon, he said, I'm amazed at the effect. They're frightened to death of me and my team. And I said, well, why are they frightened to death? If they're doing everything okay, there shouldn't be any problem. He said, well, that's the point. They're not following the system. They never are following the system. Now, when you think about that, we didn't get up. We weren't born wanting to corrupt the system we work in, or do things wrongly on purpose. Why do we do it a different way to the way we're supposed to do it? Because the bloody system doesn't work. So we find ways around it. When we audit something and find it's wrong, we should always be thinking, why are people doing it this way? And it's because they found a workaround. The system doesn't work, but we've got to get it to work, so we'll do it like this. But if anybody checks up on us, we'll get a bollocking because we've done it not in the system. In other words, we need to go back to see why people, when we find out stuff, then why didn't it? That's the first point. The second point is, with emerging technology and increasing digitalization, this task should become a lot easier. First of all, for people to create systems that do work and can run, therefore they don't need to find ways of doing it differently and then get found out when they're audited. And also the auditors can use the emerging technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to improve the way they discover things that are not wrong. And when they do, not right. And when they do discover that, use the same approaches, new technology, to actually correct the system, not find people out as if they're criminals. That's my contribution to that debate.
Go back to Elena on that one, because what I'm listening to and what I'm thinking about, and I'm currently working with a well-known British railway infrastructure organisation, what I'm worried about is not what they know, but what they don't know, and what they don't know, they don't know. And I think that, Elena, is your point, is it?
About the incompleteness, yes.
Yeah.
It's like what's hiding in the bushes.
Yeah.
You know, have the maintenance schedules been keeping up with what actually is needed? Are they keeping track of their pension obligations? You'd think those things would be obvious, but quite often they're omitted.
And they're omitted for a reason. And we need to find out what that reason is, because it's probably a good reason, if you know what I mean. It doesn't work if you try to do it the way it's designed. That's often the problem.
I suspect the reason might often be so they look good on their profit and loss statements, but that might be
whatever. Yeah. No, if you keep getting taken to task because you're not doing X, you'll make sure X happens, even if it damages Y. And nobody looks at
that point, John. So David, you put your hand up.
Okay, so on Monday, the line from London to Exeter was largely closed down because an old freight train broke down and they missed lots of passengers and so on. And then yesterday, there were delays again as the freight train broke down again and came back. But surely we've sort of avoided emitting a lot of carbon. We have avoided building a new freight train, which would be tremendously ecological. The point is the one that I put in the chat. We can see all these linkages, but until we can begin to quantify them, which is a pretty horrible job, it doesn't tell the manager, the person who decides, or the people who decides what to do and how far they can align, you know, allegedly socially desirable outcomes with, you know, stopping the outfit from going bust, or perhaps asking for larger subsidies from the taxpayer. So I say systems thinking is lovely in showing you links between blobs and lines, but until you do a pretty comprehensive exercise, which will partly be wrong anyway, isn't it really sort of wishfulness and magic?
No, it's not. I'm sorry, Carl might want to answer that, but
so
I'll say why.
Tell me why.
I like no, it's not as a short answer. Carl, what's your view?
Yeah, so I would say that you can appreciate those types of things at scale, really. So the answer to you, the reason why perhaps I can surmise the reason why a freight train broke is because, and you could probably prove this, is that the commercial frameworks and the incentives are not sufficiently effective enough which would have prevented that from happening, or they're not set up in such a way. So, for instance, if the rail freight operator and the maintainer, which they're separate and they can easily be separate entities, had back-to-back penalty clauses in as part of their contractual frameworks, then the reliability of that component, for instance, would be far better and greater than it actually was. It's just that, you know, there's the continuity of and the integrity of those things. Well, not, I mean, I'll give you Rolls-Royce, for instance. Okay, Rolls-Royce sell jet engines on power by the, you don't buy an engine from Rolls-Royce. You can only buy what the engine does, right? So so the argument is, well, what's stopping that scaling, for instance? And I'm just hypothesizing. What's stopping that scaling so that obviously there's a whole raft of safety issues associated with it. You've got a problem if an engine stops because a plane falls out of the sky.
The customers for Rolls-Royce engines are a darn sight more sophisticated than the majority of customers, and they're tooled up to check product quality in the way that most players in the market cannot possibly do. So, you know, we don't get too many Duff plane engines, statistically speaking, say, compared to car engines.
There's a trade-off, isn't there, between the cost of the failure, whether that's financial or in human life, and the cost of preventing that failure. So there's a sort of value equation. If I'm a rail operator, you know, the worst that can happen is my train stops. Nobody's going to die. Everything's going to be a bit late. So there's a trade-off to me. That says, I will risk a bit of dodgy maintenance because the consequence is relatively low and the frequency is also relatively low. Whereas, you know, particularly with aircraft, once you've got them up there, if the engines fail, they're up there all night. Jonathan, come on,
well,
you might have a comment on this one.
Can I just say that?
Let Jonathan come in. He knows a little bit about Rolls-Royce, John.
Yeah.
So,
I thought we were talking about diesel engines, but never mind.
yeah. So it's interesting because when for anyone who doesn't know, I worked for Rolls for years and years. When the whole total care model was something that the company did back in the 90s, but we broke our own business model. And that was to give competitive advantage to align more with customers' requirements. So the old model was time and materials, and each OEM in that market made money by charging a premium on the spares. So we broke that model, and we're now in the power by hour. So there's huge incentives in terms of making sure that the part that removes the engine, that you get the maximum life out of that. I think that's separate from the safety bit, which I think goes back to some of the discussion in your presentation, John, about quality versus cost, which I would define as performance versus cost.
Yeah.
In the airline industry, regardless of the commercial model, there are aviation requirements, but each manufacturer wants to be way above that in terms of how many hours on average does it take for an in-flight shutdown? Because if you get an in-flight shutdown of an engine over a large expanse of water, it's really scary. But compare that with the diesel scenario, then you can afford an in-service shutdown. There's still a level you don't want to be below for kind of availability reasons, but that level can be lower because it's more convenient rather than
I think that's really important there, because that's this fundamental difference around the compliance. Because I think it would be reasonable to say, and again, there's plenty of evidence actually, it's not reasonable, it's factual. So things are manufactured to meet compliance, which is a minimum acceptable level of performance. Whereas in your particular field, you've broken that model because the competitiveness of the product is by how much the products exceed the minimum level of threshold by, and that is fundamentally important, and that is also essentially what the performance of the asset is based on. That, you know, it's not what the asset is, it's the performance of it.
So if we come back on that point, so I'm going to go back to John. I'm just going to make the observation that if I look at Rolls-Royce's current finances, it might be that the broken model needs breaking again. Power by the hour doesn't work if nobody's flying. John.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Jonathan, I'm happy if you want to replace quality with performance. I would argue we don't want to lose the quality word. If you say to people, and they tell you about an issue they're having, and if you say, yeah, it's a quality problem, and explain to them why it is, because the engine, you know, the performance and quality, you've got other aspects of performance, which is delivery performance, cost performance, and so on. Going back to David's point, this is what I meant when I said in the first place, no. It is that organization is the organization running the trains has got data coming out of its ears, but it's not using that data at all. So, but the modern world, we've got the computer power to take all that data and give you sufficient information to make far, far better decisions. And the basic one in that case would be, would we be better off buying a new engine or maintaining this one when it's on the bathtub curve of failure rate? Clearly not. So if you piled all that data into bog standard computer models, it will give you the answer. Or it will give you far more information than those managers are receiving to make better decisions. It's not because they're useless, it's because they're not being provided with the right stuff. We're working with the likes of Yorkshire Water, Vodafone, Network Rail to, if you like, crunch so much data you couldn't think about it, millions and millions of rows and columns on spreadsheets, and making better decisions about projects, whether they're going to be over budget, how long they'll take, and so on. And we can prove those, you know, we can prove all that. That's now available. So they should be using it, and the top managers will be crying out for that. The executives at Vodafone at one point couldn't tell you, couldn't be told, they weren't receiving information on a Monday how many people had opened a new account on the Saturday. How stupid is that? But it's available. You just plug all that data, which is collected, into the appropriate model, gives you the data. So there's no way that problem you described, David, is not solvable these days.
Ooh, I can see you can collect a lot more data, and maybe you can compute it more effectively than a lot of large data computers do. I feel there's still a limit that you're not capturing everything in the whole scene, but you know, I'd love a detailed thing to prove me wrong. That probably would not be
let's put it this way: you're better off doing that than not doing that, and using knife and fork methods to try and decide whether we carry on failing all the time or we invest in the future technology.
Providing the consultants cheap enough.
Can I come in, guys? So Rory, you've had your hand up quite a while now. I think we've got a quick question and a quick answer, and then we might get you back on again, Mr. Randall, very briefly afterwards. We'll see on the length of the answer. Rory.
Just wanted to come back to incentives. I think what David said and what Carl mentioned about incentives, and I think it might be a framing issue, is that when you're paying for longevity or you're paying for something to be of better quality and more reliable, you're paying for something not to happen, versus when you're paying for performance, you are paying for something to happen, which is a difference in framing and a difference in perspective, which we're all primitive monkeys in the end, and we're susceptible to these sorts of things. And again, if you're paying for longevity, you're paying for something in the future. So it's an investment, and then the time value of money is involved. So you could be spending an extra 5 million on a jet engine that's going to last another 5 years. Well, could I invest that 5 million in another avenue, which is then going to produce a return which is greater than the return I would get from an extra 5 years on the jet engine?
And you need a model to work that out.
Yes,
But the
yes,
thing
you
is,
would.
it's all about probabilities and risk. Every
Yeah.
organization on nearly every major component part and the whole bloody jet engine or diesel engine itself should understand full detail of the bathtub curve. What early failure do we have? What's the probability of failure in adult life? And when does the bathtub curve start to go up? Why do you
What's
think
the name of that curve? Sorry.
The bathtub curve, Rory.
The bathtub
failure
curve.
rate curve. If you
You'll
plot
find
a
it in-
curve
you'll find it in John's
of
books.
human beings, some die young, people die as babies, the curve's high, then it goes flat, then when you get to 70 odd, it starts going up again. It's called the bathtub curve, and it's all about probability of failure. And people need to know about that for their service, their product, and so on. So you
John,
offer
I'll have to
6-year
silence-
guarantee because the bathtub curve goes up after 6 years. It's simple stuff, really.
I'll have to silence you, John, because we are virtually. Jonathan, can you make your question a statement rather than a question?
Absolutely. Just to be clear, earlier when I was talking about cost and performance, I was arguing that they are separate but related variables. And when you're trading with cost, I think the first one you're trading with performance, it may have a knock-on impact on how much quality you invest in, but it's performance that you're initially trading versus cost.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jonathan. Right, everybody, very nearly 7 o'clock, so I'm going to stop the discussion, which did exactly what I hoped it would do, which was a little bit of debate, a little bit of discussion, lots of thoughtfulness going on. So thank you to John and thank you to Carl, whatever you're hiding on my screen now, for both of those. Carl, I would very much appreciate having your slides. For my purposes, I'm happy to share them with everybody else as well, but there's some there I want to go through. Similarly with yours, John, at the appropriate point, if I could have them, because there's some really good stuff in there that I wanted to reprocess in real time.
I did send them, John. I did send them, but you didn't.
I know I've got them. I just remembered that when I was saying it, but I was too late to stop myself. As ever, I will put the recording onto YouTube as soon as I can, and hopefully see you all again next month to hear Angela Espinosa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
Bye.